Seclusion, isolation, and restraint. The purpose of newly adopted board policy: promote safety and prevent harm to students, school personnel, and visitors in the school district. Foster a climate of dignity and respect in the use of discipline and behavior management techniques. Provide school personnel with clear guidelines about the use of seclusion, isolation, and restraint in response to emergency situations. Provide parents and guardians information about state guidelines and district policies related to the use of discipline, behavior management, behavior interventions, and responses to emergency situations. Policy applicability. Board policy has been adopted regarding seclusion, isolation, and restraint. This policy applies to all district personnel as defined in the policy. All district personnel are responsible for knowing and following the policy. To view the board policy, please visit the website below. Training. Per board policy, all district personnel are to be trained annually and know the policy and procedures involving the use of seclusion, isolation, and restraint. Training for all staff members shall include all of the following, which is included in this presentation: a continuum of prevention of techniques, environmental management techniques, a continuum of de-escalation techniques, information about our district policy. Training. It is important to note that viewing this presentation does not certify a staff member to perform a restraint. Staff members who may be required to perform restraints are required to participate in Crisis Prevention Institute, CPI training, in addition to this viewing of this presentation. Use of seclusion, isolation, and restraint. Seclusion. The confinement of a student alone in an enclosed space from which the student is physically prevented from leaving by locking hardware. Seclusion, as defined in this policy, is prohibited except in an emergency situation while awaiting the arrival of law enforcement officers, as provided for in state law. Isolation. The confinement of a student alone in an enclosed space without locking hardware. Isolation does not include supervised in-school suspension, detention, or timeout used as disciplinary consequences in accordance with the district's student discipline code. Isolation shall only be used in an emergency situation or when less restrictive measures have not effectively de-escalated the situation and the school has a plan for how to respond in such situations, or with parental approval as specified in a student's IEP, Section 504 plan, or other agreed upon plans to address a student's behavior. Isolation shall never be used as a form of punishment or for the convenience of district personnel. Physical restraint. The use of person-to-person physical contact to restrict the free movement of all or a portion of a student's body. This does not include briefly holding a student without undue force for instructional or other purposes, briefly holding a student to calm the student, taking a student's hand to transport him or her for safety purposes, physical escort, or intervening in a fight. Physical restraint shall only be used in an emergency situation or when less restrictive measures have not effectively de-escalated the situation and the school has a plan for how to respond in such situations, or with parental approval as specified in a student's IEP, Section 504 plan, or other agreed upon plans to address a student's behavior. Physical restraint will only be used for as long as necessary to resolve the actual risk of danger or harm that warranted the use of physical restraint, being no greater than the degree of force necessary to protect the student or other persons from imminent bodily injury or to protect property. Not place pressure or weight on the chest, lungs, sternum, diaphragm, back, neck, or throat that restricts breathing. Only be done by district personnel trained in the proper use of physical restraint, CPI trained personnel. Physical restraints shall never be used as a form of punishment or for the convenience of district personnel. Mechanical restraint. A device or physical object that the student cannot easily remove that restricts a student's freedom of movement or normal access to a portion of his or her body. This includes, but is not limited to, straps, duct tape, cords, or garments. The term does not include assistive technology devices. Mechanical restraint shall only be used as specified in a student's IEP or Section 504, with two exceptions. Vehicle safety restraints shall be used according to state and federal regulations. Mechanical restraints employed by law enforcement officers in school settings should be used in accordance with appropriate professional standards and applicable policies. Chemical restraint. Administration of a drug or medication to manage a student's behavior that is not a standard treatment and dosage for the student's medical condition. Chemical restraints shall never be used by district personnel. Use of timeout and use of adversive interventions. Use of timeout. Brief removal from sources of positive reinforcement that does not meet the definition of seclusion or isolation. The purpose of timeout is to separate the student from the attention of staff and other students. Nothing in this policy is intended to prohibit the use of timeout as defined in this policy. Use of aversive interventions. An intervention that is intended to inflict pain or discomfort upon a student for the purpose of eliminating or reducing maladaptive behaviors, including such interventions as contingent application of noxious, painful, or intrusive spray, inhalants, or tastes, or other similar interventions. The term does not include such interventions as voice control limited to loud, firm commands, time-limited ignoring of a specific behavior, token fines as part of token economy system, brief physical prompts to interrupt or prevent a specific behavior, interventions medically necessary for the treatment or protection of the student, or other similar interventions. Corporal punishment administered in accordance with state law is not an aversive intervention for the purpose of this policy. Aversive interventions will only be used in accordance with this policy. District personnel shall never use aversive interventions that compromise health and safety. Students with disabilities. If the IEP or Section 504 plan of a student with a disability includes the use of seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversive behavior intervention, the IEP or Section 504 plan must specify the conditions under which seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversive behavior intervention may be used. The IEP or Section 504 plan must include steps to eliminate the need for the use of seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversive behavior intervention. Any use of seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversive behavior intervention must be limited to those interventions which may be utilized with non-disabled students in accordance with this policy and may be articulated in the IEP or Section 504 plan. Before adding the use of seclusion, isolation, restraint, or aversive behavior intervention to an IEP or Section 504 plan, the student must have undergone appropriate assessments, including, but not limited to, a formal functional behavior assessment, and the student must have a BIP in place. Prevention and environmental management techniques. 10 tips for crisis prevention. Be empathetic. Try not to judge or discount the feelings of others. Whether or not you think their feelings are justified, those feelings are real to the other person. Pay attention to them. Clarify messages. Listen for the person's real message. What are the feelings behind the facts? Ask reflective questions and use both silence and restatements. Respect personal space. Stand at least 1.5 to 3 feet from an acting out person. Invading personal space tends to increase the individual's anxiety and may lead to acting out behavior. Be aware of your body position. Standing eye to eye and toe to toe with a person in your charge sends a challenging message. Standing one leg length away and at an angle off to the side is less likely to escalate the individual. Ignore challenging questions. When a person in your charge challenges your authority or a facility position, redirect the individual's attention to the issue at hand. Answering challenging questions often results in a power struggle. Permit verbal venting when possible. Allow the individual to release as much energy as possible by venting verbally. If you cannot allow this, state directives and reasonable limits during lulls in the venting process. Set and enforce reasonable limits. If the person becomes belligerent, defensive, or disruptive, state limits and directives clearly and concisely. When setting limits, offer choices and consequences to the acting out individual. Keep your nonverbal cues non-threatening. The more an individual loses control, the less that individual listens to your actual words. More attention is paid to your nonverbal communication. Be aware of your gestures, facial expressions, movements, and tone of voice. Avoid overreacting. Remain calm, rational, and professional. Your response will directly affect the person's behavior. Use physical techniques only as a last result. Use the least restrictive method of intervention possible. Physical techniques should be used only when the individuals are in danger to themselves or others. Physical interventions should be used only by competent, trained staff. Any physical intervention may be dangerous. De-escalation techniques. Communication is the key to crisis de-escalation. The 5 keys are: give the person undivided attention. When people are paid attention to, they feel validated. They feel important. The converse is also true. People feel less important and sometimes feel they need to up the ante if they feel like they need attention. Paying attention doesn't just mean saying, "I'm listening." It means looking at the person, making eye contact, if it's culturally appropriate, and virtually listening with the entire body. By really listening and conveying that through body language as well as words, the listener can take away the person's reason for escalating the situation. Be non-judgmental. If someone says, "The lights are talking to me," the listener's immediate reaction may be to think that the person is crazy. That reaction, especially if verbalized, will probably upset the individual even more. Even if it is not said aloud, that attitude may be conveyed through the listener's body language. If someone is psychotic, he or she may tune into the nonverbal communication much more than words. So paying attention to what is said will ensure that body language and tone are non-judgmental as well. This will go a lot further in calming the individual. Focus on the person's feelings. Going back to the previous example, if an individual says, "The lights are talking to me," a feeling response might be, "That must be pretty scary," or even, "Tell me what that feels like." Most likely, it will elicit a response that is positive, since the individual will know that the listener understands what is happening. Allow silence. If the individual doesn't immediately answer a question, it doesn't mean he or she didn't hear you. It may mean that he or she's thinking about the answer or saying the right thing. Allow a moment of silence. If the person's face registers confusion, then repeat the question and let silence happen again. Another good reason for silence is that no one likes it and people tend to start talking when silence lengthens. Use restatement to clarify messages. When a person makes a statement, the listener may think he or she knows what the person means. The only way to be sure is to ask. Sometimes a question may be perceived as challenging and can make the subject defensive, so restatement can be used instead. For example, a student may say, "I don't want to work on this anymore." The teacher might think he or she knows what the student is saying, but instead of making an assumption, the teacher should restate, "Oh, are you ready to move on to the next activity?" The student could say yes, or the student could say no, and provide clarification on what he or she meant by the statement. In either case, the teacher has shown an interest in the student and kept the lines of communication open. Conclusion. Thank you for taking the time to view this presentation. To view the board policy, please visit the website below. On the following slide, please fill in your name on the certificate, print the certificate, and submit a copy to your building principal.